Hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to see you all. Um, my name is Diane Buis. I am here at MedTech Innovator, where I'm director of the US program. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live, our series of weekly webinars that we do as part of the Accelerator program. The Accelerator program runs for 4 months. And these webinars are an opportunity for the companies across our 3 cohorts, specifically the US cohort for whom we do these webinars, to learn from experts all across the ecosystem. And for the folks joining us on the live streams, MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator of medical devices and healthcare IT in the world. We're a downstream accelerator, and that means that we're not looking for people with ideas, but the startups in our cohort are people with companies that are up and running. They have teams and prototypes and early evidence, sometimes later evidence, that the technology works. And then we partner them with experts in the industry, strategics and others, to help them bring these products to market as quickly and efficiently as possible, with as much value as possible. And we're opening these webinars up to our broader ecosystem beyond the cohorts. Basically as a means to make sure that people that did not get into this year's program can still benefit. So if you're on the live stream on LinkedIn Live or on YouTube, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A over there. For our cohort companies, you can use the Q&A function and the chat function, and we'll get to those later. I'll try to get to the live stream questions first before we have a private Q&A for 30 minutes at the end of the hour. And so with that, and without further ado, it's a real pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We've got a great set of perspectives in the room today, really from all aspects of strategic partnerships. Strategic partnerships are, if we think about it, something that many of the accelerator companies are looking for as an exit path, as an investment path, as a channel partner. And those are some of the discussions we want to have today. It's my real pleasure to introduce our panelists. I'll give them an opportunity to introduce their work, their companies, and themselves in a second. We have Adam Zerda, who is Senior Director of Public Affairs at Becton Dickinson, MedTech Innovator partner. We've got Biren Mehta, who is at JJDC, which is the venture arm of Johnson & Johnson. Also, both of them longtime partners and mentors in the program. And we've got an alum. We've got David Tuck, who ran through the Accelerator program in 2015 and who recently exited. And so we'll want to learn a little bit more about that, but also on the path of working with strategics en route to that exit that so many of our audience hope to achieve. With that, I think I'll start in the order I introduced you. Adam, would you go first, telling us a little bit more about yourself and your work, and then I'll hand it over to Biren and David?
Sure, Diane, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am with BD, and just as a disclaimer, first and foremost, I'll be speaking in my own capacity here and not representing necessarily the perspectives of the company. I'm based in North Carolina, have been with BD for 16 years. My background is research and development, and over the time that I've been with the company, have had roles in R&D and strategic marketing, innovation, M&A, and then most recently, I'm part of the public affairs organization, where I focus on international partnerships that BD participates in with multilateral organizations, NGOs, and other public sector organizations that help us achieve our goal of providing access to medtech tools around the world. So pleased to meet you, and as Diane noted, have a long history of MedTech Innovator, fantastic program, and really happy to be back and hopefully sharing something that may be helpful to all of you. Diane?
Thanks, Biren. Would you introduce yourself and your work?
Yeah, sure. Diane and Paul, first of all, thank you guys for having me here. Super excited to be here to talk about strategic partnerships. So I work for a small company called Johnson & Johnson. Um, I specifically work in our venture capital arm of the group, which is called JJDC, which stands for Johnson & Johnson Development Corporation. It is a 50-year-old organization, JJDC is. I think it's the oldest healthcare corporate VC that there is. We have a fairly large portfolio of about 170 active portfolio companies, both across medtech and pharma. So about me specifically, I am based in Southern California. I lead medtech investing in the western half of the U.S. So we have a number of investors in the group, and I focus on the western half, and I focus on medtech. I've been with J&J for 15 years. I spent the first 14 responsible for corporate development, business development for a group of medtech companies within J&J. So in my group, I had our cardiovascular business, neurovascular, ophthalmology, and a few others. In total, it was $10 billion of business. And I had a chance to do a number of strategic partnerships during that time, as well as acquisitions for J&J. I've only moved into this new role in the last year on the venture side. My longer term background is I started off as an engineer. I had done my grad school work in biomedical engineering and computer science. Eventually, I got my MBA, and it's when I got that, I switched over to banking. So I did investment banking, I went to a hedge fund, and then that was right before I joined J&J 15 years ago. So really looking forward to talking about strategic partnerships with all of you today. And again, thanks for having me.
So glad you're here, David. I recognize that I didn't even mention your company's name. And so do tell us a little bit more about yourself and LightPoint Medical.
Absolutely. Thanks, Diane. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. My name is David Tuck. I'm founder and CEO of LightPoint Medical. LightPoint provides surgeons with tools to detect cancer during surgery. Our lead product is the Sensei robotic probe, which is a miniature drop-in probe that surgeons can use to find cancer in real time during robotic surgery. We recently sold to a public pharmaceutical company called Telix Pharmaceuticals, which is a very nice way to capstone our experience with MTI. It seems like just yesterday we went through the MTI orientation, very similar to the companies joining us today. And it's very nostalgic to be here with you today to round out our involvement with MTI. Prior to founding LightPoint, I've spent my career in a combination of strategic alliance and R&D roles in medical devices and pharma. I was with Novartis Pharmaceuticals in Basel, Switzerland for the bulk of my career, and I'm now based in lovely Boston, Massachusetts. So it's great to be here with you today, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Appreciate the introductions. And David, perhaps staying with you a little bit, just because I feel many of the entrepreneurs in the audience will mostly identify with you. I would love to hear how you thought initially through approaching strategics, what types of strategics and how you thought through approaching them. And then fast forward, what became of the initial plans?
Absolutely. So I think in the spirit of always be selling, it's important to nurture your relationships with strategics from a very early stage. And the creative balance is how do you be very specific what your ask is at the same time that you're trying to build those early relationships with the strategics, perhaps even before you're looking for capital or co-development or strategic distribution. So in the very early stages of LightPoint around the time of MTI, the focus was really on building relationships, building confidence, building awareness so that we could have a level of familiarity for the future as we approach more concrete discussions with the strategics. And then once we developed the company to a point where we had very specific asks, we were then in a position where we had relationships and confidence and the background in order to be very specific and targeted in what we were asking for. It also has the advantage that as in the same way that investors invest in lines and not dots, that is, they look at progress as opposed to where you might be at a given instance in time. That way you have the advantage of saying, we did the things that we said we were going to do when we had that conversation at MTI a number of years ago. Here we are now. We've achieved our registrations. Let's talk about what's next. In the specific case of LightPoint, as we announced, we had the recent acquisition by Telix Pharmaceuticals. That was a very nice example because it was actually built on the basis of a partnership that we had struck with Telix, where we would provide the devices to be used in combination with their cancer-targeted imaging drug. So it was a very natural progression for us to start dating before we went to matrimony. So that was a very nice example of a partnership starting at a given phase and then maturing into a eventual acquisition. It's also public information that we have strategic investment from Konica Minolta, the Japanese conglomerate, and we also have an undisclosed partnership with a large medical device company that's focused on product compatibility. So that covers 3 examples of partnerships, both co-development, acquisition, strategic investment, and then also product compatibility. And I think as we get into the discussion later on, we can talk about the range of options available for partnering. And those are the 3 specific examples that we were involved with at LightPoint.
Fantastic. Lots of strings to pull on for the conversation as to what engagement can look like. I might just do a 2-second follow-up question. When did your initial engagement with Telix start? So for folks to have an idea, from initial contact to exit, how many years, roughly?
Yes, so the partnership started approximately 4 years ago, and the public elements of that partnership involve co-clinical trials where we use our device in combination with their cancer-targeted imaging drug, and then there are also certain confidential aspects to that partnership as well. And it's interesting to think whether or not acquisition was in the mind of the buyer at that point of the partnership. And then the discussions about the acquisition in earnest started approximately 9 months ago, and we announced the asset sale in June of this year.
I appreciate you humoring that follow-up. And I think that tees it up for a discussion with our strategics on the call, right? What does that look like? And especially perhaps the initial caveat of not every discussion will eventually lead to M&A, and perhaps is not even in the thinking process. It is potentially co-development. Let's see what the other person has. I'd just like to start perhaps with Biren. Tips for a good engagement. At what stage should a company reach out? Is a warm introduction better? Is cold outreach better? What is the door to entry? The stage and the path. I love your comments, and I'll ask you the same question, Adam. Biren first.
Yeah, so this is probably a very common question to startup companies, and the question is, getting to the right person. And so you take a company like J&J, we have over 100,000 employees. And half the battle is finding who's the right person to even listen to what you have to say. And so at any time, you're going to either be talking to the right person or hopefully a person who can guide you to the right person. And so depending on who that is, you gotta understand the context of what you're sharing and share the appropriate amount so you can get the help that you need. So until you get to the right person, you might talk to a lot of people in the company. Really, for those conversations, keep it very high level. Be very clear about what space you're in. The startup companies, you guys know your spaces so well. But if I look at J&J MedTech, it's a $30 billion business with dozens and dozens of companies. So if you come in and start talking about some very specific, detailed thing, I may have no clue what space you're even talking about. So first of all, when you're still trying to find the right person, be very clear about what space your product is in. And then ideally, like if you know what division that relates to for the strategic. So for example, if someone came to me with an electrophysiology idea and said, hey, I have something that I think Biosense Webster would be very interested in, that's going to help me out a lot to figure out first, where am I in the world? The second thing to be very clear about when you're still trying to figure out who the right person is what are you looking for? So are you looking for an investment? Are you looking for a partnership? Are you looking for just networking? You need to be very clear for that, because the contact person for those different things will be different in a large company. So now, once you find the right person, every company should be prepared to provide a short introduction of themselves. And what that means is very eloquently and succinctly covering the market, the technology, your value proposition, your differentiation, what stage you're at, what's your ask. And this is typically can be done in a one-pager. So I always recommend for every startup, have a very well prepared one-pager on your company. And then that can be your intro to anyone. And usually when there's a bite of interest, you should be able to go to a non-confidential deck. Usually I will ask a company, send me your non-confidential deck. I will have our team take a look at it and I will get back to you. And I don't want anything confidential. I don't want to put an NDA in place yet. I just want to know enough or be able to share enough internally so I can figure out if this is something of interest. So these are the two things I would suggest having ready to go at any time, is a one-pager and a non-confidential deck.
That is great, tangible advice. Adam, anything to add or anything different in how people should approach either you personally or more broadly a strategic?
Yeah, a small quibble with the advice that Bjorn sent. I agree that we should not assume that we will know your space as well as you do. You certainly know your spaces much better than we do. And in fact, that's oftentimes one of the motivating factors for a strategic partnership with a strategic, is we're looking to understand spaces that we're not yet in. And so keep that in mind. What I do suggest, though, is give me something. If you're reaching out to me, for example, give me something to forward to the right teams within the company to get them interested, right? Oftentimes, people who are in roles like I was in or Bjorn are in, we're frankly gatekeepers. We're looking to try to understand if what you're working on is strategically aligned with an area of interest to the company. And we tend to keep a very broad lens on that. But give me something to work with. So a non-confidential deck for me was always a preference. A one-pager for me tended to be a little too high level. So a non-confidential deck would be fantastic. It gives me an idea of what you're working on, tends to show me what stage of development you're in. Is this an idea company? Is this a product company? Is this a clinical trial company? And that helps me understand quite a bit as to who to go to. Because frankly, it might be something that would be of interest to our R&D teams if it's really early stage, or maybe our clinical teams or even our M&A teams, depending on the stage of development. So give me something to work with. The one area that I'll double down on that Bjorn said is have in mind what you're interested in. And it should not always be investment. In fact, that's probably the last thing that you should be bringing up. Are you interested in a go-to-market partner? Are you interested in somebody like David mentioned, a partner for clinical trials? Are you addressing a need that I have as a company, or are you addressing a need that my customers have that you can help me address better? Have that in mind pretty clearly. It's similar advice as you probably heard if you're interviewing for a job. Know who you're interviewing for and what gap or what problem you're going to be able to solve for that company. You'll be doing the same thing as a startup leader.
I'll follow that up with a question really on the stage of the company. Just because that can be pretty broad, and just that, like I said in my opening remarks, MedTech Innovator in general, we are a downstream accelerator. So the companies that you're mentoring through our program definitely have prototypes or well beyond the napkin drawing. But more broadly, what is the right stage to approach a strategic? And I would understand if the answer is it depends on what you're seeking. You just teed it up. But I'd love to hear your views. Perhaps I'll stay with you, Adam. at what stage should a company engage with a strategic? Is it when they already have, say, FDA approval? Is it before that? At what stage in that journey should a company engage?
That's a really hard question to answer quickly. It really does depend. In my experience, I've engaged with companies that have been very early because they help us understand spaces that we may not understand yet, or technologies that we may not understand yet that we're still trying to work through. And those have been very fruitful partnerships, right? Where a company is working on a technology that we know is very exciting, but we're not quite sure what it means for us. And so you may not have a product yet, but you're an expert in a technology that we don't understand. If you're thinking about something that's closer to the example that David mentioned, yeah, you've got to have a product well underway to some regulatory approval, because if we're going to start putting this into patients, clearly coming to me and saying, I'll have this ready in 3 years is not really going to cut it. But my general advice, though, is go earlier than later. You want to give the strategic an opportunity to understand you better, to understand how you fit within the portfolio. And we'll probably touch on this in a little bit. That takes a long time, right? It's especially for small companies like BD's or J&J's. It takes a long time to build that kind of momentum, the social network and the buy-in. So generally speaking, earlier the better.
Bjorn, I see you nodding. If you don't have anything to add, I'm also happy to pass it on to David to see when he approached companies. Bjorn, do you want to weigh in first?
Maybe I was nodding because I think Adam's comment of approach early, it doesn't hurt, because it's important to start building those relationships early. So I thought that was great advice. J&J invests at all stages, so there is no one fit answer. But I can provide maybe 3 dimensions that we consider when we think about the right stage for an investment. So the first one is this startup in a core area for us, or is it in an adjacency? So the reason I share that is if something is in a core area for us, we're more likely going to invest earlier. I'm right now in the process of closing something that is a seed round, pre-first in man, on a company that is in a core area for us. And it's because we know the space very well. If it's something that's potentially disruptive, we want to get in early. So that's one dimension. Another one is what category of regulatory pathway it falls in. If something is a 510K, it's more likely that we will get involved earlier versus a PMA, just because the journey is shorter. Oftentimes a company will do one round of funding to go from pre-first in man to commercialization. And you don't find that on a PMA company very often, but that's why it could make sense to go earlier on a 510K product. And the last thing I'll just mention is that some startups have something that's more like an enabling technology, that it by itself is not likely going to become a product in the market, but through some type of co-development with an established product on the market, it can be very impactful. And so when you run into something like this, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to go very early, do something that's collaborative with them, and actually onboard them or consider even an M&A earlier on than usual, because it's an enabling technology. You want to get that technology under your roof into your product development process so that eventually when you deliver it to the market, it's an integrated product with something you already have. And if you wait for the company to keep developing this enabling technology and build out all the pieces of the solution, you don't need 9 out of 10 of those pieces when you eventually acquire it. So it's not a great use of capital. So enabling technologies can go much earlier as well.
I'd like to stay on something that you just said, and that is core area of interest. Basically, I'm going to call it your main business line. And that to me speaks to preparation, as in, how do I even pick which strategic to talk to? How well prepared should a startup be to articulate this is, I know this is in your core area. I'll start with David. David, did you cast a wide net and approach a whole variety of strategics, or did you pick 2 or 3, and how did you learn what their core areas of interest are? And then I'll ask both Adam and Biren about how should people learn what you're currently interested in.
It's a very interesting question. Let me start with the last question first, which is how do you determine the strategic's interests? So in addition to asking your strategic partner, there's some other resources that can be incredibly useful. One is to tune into the investor presentations that the companies give to the market and analysts, and that can be very useful. And what's particularly useful there is also to hear the analyst questions and comments at the end, because they'll identify some of the gaps and tease out some of the thinking behind the strategic's initiatives. So if a strategic says we are planning on building a robotic platform, and the analyst asks, well, how are you going to differentiate your platform? And the strategic says, we'll be looking at advanced imaging and sensing tools in order to provide some technical differentiation from the other players in the robotic surgery market. That gives you a much more nuanced and direct from the source view on what their particular strategic gaps are. And I think it touches on this old question of whether or not companies buy companies out of love and or fear. That is, are they buying you because they love the technology and they love the team and they love the market, or is it a competitive or defensive mood and they're looking to taking you out? I think a healthy combination of both is always helpful. So that's something to consider as well. I think one dynamic that's maybe also underappreciated is the priorities and the objectives of the specific team leading the acquisition or partnering arrangement from the strategic. So they might have specific objectives around achieving certain targets that are more detailed than the high-level corporate objectives. And so understanding what is the specific professional or performance objective of the particular unit or department that I'm speaking with at the strategic, that can be extraordinarily useful as well. For more inside information, you can also speak with investment bankers who broker deals for a living, and very often they have access to inside information that they can give you on what some of the strategic interests and gaps are at the companies that you're speaking with. And those can be both bulge bracket IBs like JP Morgan and others, or even some of the more boutique IBs that can give you insights on what the specific interests of the acquirers are. So I think there's a range of tools that you can really draw on in order to understand, what are the interests of the strategic, and then also what are some of the gaps that they're looking to fill in completing an acquisition.
That's helpful. Thanks for kind of like the tangible strategy there. So anything to add, perhaps Adam, followed by Biren? How should people learn what is currently in the bullseye of what you're interested in? Is it the analysts? Is it the market calls? Is it the website? How should people learn what to approach you specifically, but more broadly, strategics for?
Yeah, I would certainly start with the investor calls and the investor days, and maybe our presentations at, say, a JP Morgan conference. That's a good place to start. It's probably going to be a bit high level if you're looking at a very broad med tech like ours, but certainly I think that's a good start. One bit of a suggestion that has worked really well for me, right? So if you're thinking about bait for Adam, here's a tip. Come to me with an example of you working with one of my customers on addressing a need. That's really an interesting way to go about it, right? That you've spoken to my customers, you understand that I work in that space, right? That BD's present there, or that the company is present there. But you've also worked with the customer to understand spaces or challenges that I'm potentially not addressing, and that you may be able to address. call it a quote, call it a testimonial, even something as simple as I was at, health system X and was talking to, the director of whatever, and here's what we were thinking about, maybe an interesting way for my company and yours to potentially collaborate. That's a really, for me, has been a pretty enticing way of connecting the dots very, very quickly.
Darren?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to what Adam shared. I think this idea of knowing your customer well is extremely important here. So when somebody comes to us, the best way to present themselves is if they understand my situation as a business. So to the best that they can, like they can't know all of our internal programs, and they can't know our latest strategy discussion about what's going to be a priority. Those are all always confidential, and frankly, we're not going to even share those very easily in a conversation. But there's a lot they can know, right? If they know the space very well, they understand the dynamics, they understand what gaps we have in our portfolio, they understand what trends we're up against. Maybe we've been losing market share for a few years. Maybe we're not playing in the highest growth part of that market. So when someone comes to me and says, I understand you guys don't have a strong offering in X, and I also understand that there's 7 competitors, so it doesn't make sense to be the 8th one unless you can bring something highly differentiated. That's why I've come to you, because I think I have something here that can fit that hole in your portfolio. Just through that, I go, wow, they understand us. They understand our situation. They understand the market, the competitive landscape. That goes a long way, I think, in getting that conversation going. And very quickly, I might tell them, that's great, but it's not an area of focus for us right now. But our areas of focus are not brain, it's not brain science. We look for growth. We're looking for high growth markets. We're looking for differentiated technology. We're looking for truly addressing unmet need. These things are pretty common across most of the strategics. So I think startups can be very well prepared for these conversations if they would like to be.
Dan, if I could, I wanted to follow up on a comment from Adam about referencing customers. I think that can be extraordinarily powerful to provide those references and testimonials. Another way to operationalize that is to have your customers approach the strategic directly and say, listen, we're really excited about this technology. This is something you should look at. And if you have enough of your KOLs and users descending on the strategic, singing the same song, that can be very powerful evidence from the marketplace that there's something exciting there to look at.
Yeah, I'm smiling broadly. That more than once have I experienced that, where a key account will come to you and say, "Hey, just FYI, we're piloting, investing, using, this widget, this product, this whatever solution. A, it's solving all of our problems. Maybe B, it's displacing you because they're better." That'll get somebody's attention very quickly.
Yeah. One way to actually see which accounts are affiliated with the particular strategic is there's a list of payments to physicians called at cmsopenpayments.gov, where you can enter the name of the company, and then it will give you an itemized list of all of the consulting fees and honoraria by physician name. And that can be a very useful way to get a broad snapshot, not a specific snapshot, but a broad snapshot of which physicians are affiliated with a particular strategic.
That's super helpful, tangible advice. Appreciate that. And you also teed up the concept of competition for us. And I know that several of the startups in the cohort have brought this exact comment up. How do I know how much to disclose and how much not to disclose? And especially you've already mentioned, especially in the early phase, people don't sign NDAs. So how should a company approach you, understanding that you have a product in market that they might be displacing? How to manage that relationship, how to manage that risk? Happy to have either of you jump in. Biren, I see you nodding.
Yeah, so this is definitely a super important question for strategics. And look, strategics have internal programs that often compete with things on the outside. And I think this is probably where you get some friction, especially in terms of what to share and how much detail to go in. I think to understand both viewpoints, first of all, from a strategic standpoint, we may be even, we may be invested or partnering with a company, and there may be some two-way agreement for that. But, until there's an M&A, a change of control, we actually don't own the company, right? So there you will find situations where a strategic has an internal program and they have a partnership, and they want to see how things evolve. And these are very tricky situations, especially if you're the startup, and you perhaps have put your whole life into the hands of this strategic. So a couple of maybe things to consider, especially on the IP front. One is, of course, be very rigorous about your IP, your strategy, protecting it. Those are typically usually very well dollars spent in a startup. When you're talking to a strategic, be very thoughtful about how much you share through the stages. Very often a startup will tell me that's not something we're comfortable to discuss at this stage. However, if we were to get to a term sheet, we definitely would include that in your confirmatory diligence. And that's fair. It depends on what the topic is, obviously, but that's fair for many things. And it's important for the startup to understand that there are some things that the strategic is going to need to check before they, for example, close an investment. So, but if you can push it out until you know that there is a high likelihood of a deal getting done, then I think it's better for the startup. The final thing is that you consider taking investments from strategics is be thoughtful about the board position you're going to provide. Because you can provide no board seat, you can provide an observer seat, you can provide a director seat, you can provide solely information rights. There's a lot of optionality, and there's some thinking that can go through that. Of course, many of the strategics will want a stronger board presence, but this is also one of the terms that's negotiable in a term sheet. So be mindful about, what is the role that strategic will play on my board, and how critical is it for me to provide them, strong board rights in order to get the deal done.
Adam, if you have something to add, happy to. Otherwise, I would like to kind of stay on the topic of the different ways of working together, because Biren teed up for us the investment scenario, right? If you're looking for investment, you're looking at term sheets, you're looking at board seats. However, as we've kind of touched upon earlier, there are different ways to engage in a collaboration and co-development with a strategic. And so how should one determine which one's right and at what moment? I'd love to kind of dig a little bit deeper on that one. And so, Adam, would you go first? How do I determine whether co-development or investment or any other structures are good? And perhaps then in a minute, we can dive a little deeper in how one can structure these agreements.
Yeah, that's a multi-layered question for sure. Look, I think this is where an accelerator program like MedTech Innovator is going to be super helpful, because you're essentially doing something like a little MBA in practice, and just the question itself it touches on quite a bit. It's not all about the exit. It's about how do you, as a startup founder, how do you look at growing your company, advancing or accelerating the development of your company? In some cases, a go-to-market partner may actually be ideal for you, right? What you have is a part of the portfolio that's complementary. Maybe the strategic isn't really sure about the space that you're working in and how viable a market that is. Probably the case in maybe a first in world type of product, right? Where there's a lot of risk. But if you're operating in a space, if you're swimming in a pool that's very closely aligned to the strategics, a go-to-market or distribution agreement may be ideal. Leverage the strength of the strategic, right? If you're first in world, chances are the strategic is not going to be ideal from a clinical study development or product development. But, in terms of a distribution, in terms of logistics, in terms of, maybe selling, maybe not, that's where you can leverage the strengths of the strategic marketing, right? How do you co-market? That be very flexible in that regard. I think in some of the experience I've had when companies are developing first in world type of solutions, they assume that because what they're doing is so novel, so innovative, so potentially game changing, that everybody's going to be jumping on board. Look, a lot of companies are very risk averse, and what they want to know is that you've got some traction, that what you're developing works, that it is going to displace whatever it's planning to displace. And so some of those approaches, like a distribution agreement, might make quite a bit of sense. In terms of other structures, joint ventures or licensing agreements, it's be thoughtful about what it is that you think the strategic can bring in a differentiated way that you yourself can't do. And that should be not just a question of, do I have enough capital as a startup? It's, do I really have those skill sets? An example might be, actually one in recent news, right? Where BioNTech and Pfizer, that agreement really leveraged the fact that Pfizer was more than likely going to be much better from a regulatory standpoint, clinical execution, and sales, right? So that structure really made sense in that at that time. Be mindful of what it is that you probably are not going to be able to buy, or if you wanted to buy, would just cost a ton of money, and think about how a strategic may be able to help you and articulate that, right? Here's what I'm bringing to the table, especially once you've gotten that strategic interest, which I think is step one. David?
Yeah, building on that, I think one other tool that companies have available is to stage the agreement, or to have a multi-part agreement, so that if you say this is going to be a strategic investment with an option to acquire, for example, or this is going to be product co-development, and if we achieve certain performance targets, then there will be a commercial distribution arrangement on the other end of that. And that's a way to titrate the involvement in a way that's appropriate for both parties. So you can say, listen, we're not ready to acquire you guys yet. We're interested in a strategic investment, but we want to have some hooks into you so that we can acquire you if everything goes well. So thinking about these multi-part agreements as a way to come up with an adjusted solution that works for all parties is a useful approach that we've used to our advantage in the past.
Yeah, I would just add to it, Dave, I couldn't agree more that what David said. Partnerships are an order of magnitude more complex than acquisitions. I mean, in an acquisition, it's a one-time transaction. You part way, essentially you're done. The company is part of you, and you move forward. And you're only thinking again about one entity. A partnership where you're trying to manage two parties for the long term, especially when one is a big company and one is a small company, it can be very challenging. And there's trade-offs. What makes it so tricky, I think, especially for the startup companies, is there's trade-offs in these decisions. So for example, if you think about co-development, in some cases, co-development could be perceived to limit your future exit options. So if I co-develop with one strategic, then what does that mean down the road in terms of who's going to want to buy me? So that could be there. Obviously, the devil's in the details. But on the other hand, sometimes it's important for a technology to show its full value, to be part of an ecosystem, right? Because procedures like hospital procedures today are happening with multiple tools, and many of them are talking to each other. And if you want your tool to be part of that, and you want to see what's the impact on the current standard of care, you also got to get into that ecosystem and then add to it. And so you can't do that without doing partnerships. And so there's that trade-off there about which way makes more sense. Similarly, on distribution, on the one hand, strategics will come if they want to distribute your product. They'll usually come and say, we want exclusive distribution rights. Why exclusive? Because it's a lot easier. Because if there's another party out there selling the same product, There's more opportunities for field conflict. There's more opportunities for price erosion. So the strategic will want exclusive rights, but for a startup to put all your eggs in one basket and say this strategic who has maybe a dozen priorities is going to take my product, and what if their priorities change? What if this product is no longer what they want to focus on? What if they have an internal product that is in the same category? Which one will they promote? My product or their own product? And so there's so many questions that would come up on giving strategic rights. And again, here it's exclusive rights. And again, here it's how is that going to be perceived by other strategics? So if you partner with Johnson & Johnson, is Medtronic going to be like, well, we're no longer interested in that startup because they've partnered with Johnson & Johnson? And then what do you do if the strategic is not performing well? So if you said, given your exclusive distribution rights and the performance is subpar, what does the startup do? Now they've, put all their eggs in one basket and they've kind of lost a little bit of control. So negotiating like all these scenarios and figuring out what should happen is extremely complex. But when done correctly, there's so many examples in the market where this created a ton of value for a startup, and eventually it led to a very attractive exit. So I'm not saying that these should not be done. I'm just saying they should be done very carefully and consider all the scenarios that may happen. Things will not be as rosy as you hope they will. There will be challenges along the way. Think about how those challenges should be addressed when you enter into those strategic distribution partnerships.
One of the variables that you just introduced with that comment, Biren, is change. It can be change of an internal champion. It can be change of the market. It is hedging against the future. In any agreement, you are hedging against any of these variables. I am wondering if either of you has specific examples on how one does structure an agreement for the long term that does hedge against change. And it's possible that you don't. And I might just start with David, because you're someone who has clearly, and in the recent past, executed agreements with several strategics. And so how have you managed both the different players as well as the potential and actual change?
There are a couple of ways to make the deal robust against change. So first, for team change at the strategic, having very robust networks within the strategic, so that if there is a change of staff or a movement within the company, you still have other relationships that you can continue to leverage. And so understanding the team dynamics within the unit so that you can call on other potential champions within the strategic is very useful. Another way to do that is to define roles as opposed to names within the agreements. So you have a representative or the right to appoint a board seat, so that you can call according to the agreement for that role to be occupied, and even nominate someone within the company to serve that role. So that's one way to make the agreement robust against personnel change. I think also building in certain protections in an agreement against change is very useful. So, for example, if the agreement is milestone-based, you can implement certain protections so that parties by mutual agreement can renegotiate the milestone if it makes strategic sense, so that the company is not disadvantaged for not achieving a milestone if it was for circumstances that were either out of their control, or if there's a valid business reason to change the milestone. So there could be a circumstance where you agree for perfectly valid business or strategic reasons that a milestone that was agreed X number of years ago no longer makes commercial sense. Let's have a fair and open conversation about how we revisit this milestone, and then build that into the agreement, so you're not in a position of having to adjust the agreement on the fly with amendments, but rather that the agreement anticipates the fact that we live in a changing world, and we've built that protection into the agreement. So I think those are probably the main tools that come to mind as we think about making agreements robust against change.
Biren and Adam, anything to add, or examples of success or less so in agreements that you've seen?
Yeah, I would just +1 on the milestones based approach. From my experience, it seems to be a preferred route in that it manages risk, both in terms of the downside, but also on the upside, honestly, right? So that you're giving opportunities for both the parties to continue or disengage, as the case may be. They do tend to complicate the agreements up front, and so be prepared for that, right? In some respects, you should understand that the party that you're speaking to has as many reservations as they do, big ideas about the future of this partnership. And when you start negotiating the minutia of a milestone that happens 3 years down the road, it can get pretty complicated as both the lawyers as well as the business teams start thinking about all the potential what ifs. But if you're trying to protect on the downside, that's the way to do it. Is makes it less about personnel and less about the relationships that you've built, which are true, significantly important. But at some point, it does need to become more of a contract. And if you're doing well and you're exceeding or meeting your obligations, then that gives you leverage. And if you're not, well, that's an opportunity to either revisit or renegotiate, or maybe find a different partner to go with.
Yeah, I'll just add maybe one example to what Adam said is, if let's say you're getting into a partnership for a distribution, a relationship, I think it's worth it for the startup to think about how this could play out. Obviously everyone thinks about the successes, but think about how it could play out, and think about what should happen that would be fair. And that, if something goes wrong, and there's a number of things that could go wrong, what should happen that would be still fair to both sides, but would allow me to get my company back on track? And so, for example, let's say you give up exclusive distribution rights because you're very excited about some strategic partner, and they're saying all the right things, and they're so committed, and you go, okay, but now, and they say, well, we're not going to take any minimums, but we think we can sell $10 million in the first year. So you go, great, they're not taking minimum. That's okay. They're very excited. Now, first year goes by and they only sell $500,000, right? And you thought, okay, the way we thought we were going to do 10, and they go, well, this and that and whatever. What should be in the contract that would allow you to get your company back on track? So, for example, it could be a provision that says, maybe they don't take a minimum of 10 million, but if they don't hit 10 million, you have the ability to terminate the relationship. Or you have the ability to convert their rights to be non-exclusive, so you can go partner with someone else. Or maybe there's a penalty they need to pay in order to help you fund the company. There's so many things you should think about like what would be my situation at that time and what would be fair, because they're very enthusiastic. But if they don't deliver, what would be a fair consequence to them in order for me to get my company back on track? And, I'm negotiating against myself right now, right? Because strategics are on the other side of this and they're trying to, but I just think it's important for a startup to protect themselves, because as Dan, you said, strategics, they have changes in leadership, they have changes in strategy, the market shifts. And, the startup, they're focused on one thing, the strategics focused on 100 things. So you got to protect yourself in these agreements. I'll share maybe, I have an example of things that we've done where we did an investment in a company. So I'm thinking about 2 cardiovascular companies. I won't mention their names, but in one of them, we did a equity investment. We took an option to distribute the product in a region. When the product got approval, we exercised the option. We started selling their product. We saw how it did with customers, and then we acquired the company. And this is kind of a very nice process. Everything went well. I think the startup would say, great, worked out well. On another cardiovascular company, we did something similar. We took the option to take distribution rights when they got approval. When they got the approval, we looked at the situation and we said, we're not interested. We don't want the distribution rights. We know we have the right for them. We don't want them. And we did it for a number of reasons, because it was going to be a very big lift in that market. We have to do a lot of market development. It wasn't a priority for us. And, not surprisingly, that company never marketed that product in that region because it was a big lift. So, it can go both ways. And so I've seen both sides of it, but yeah, sometimes it works out very well. Other times, the most important thing for the startup is try to build in enough provisions so that you can still control your destiny. If you put too much power in the hands of the strategic, you'll find yourself potentially in a really tough position.
That's super helpful. Thank you for getting really specific on examples. I know that makes a difference for a lot of companies out there. I'm looking at the time, and we got a question from LinkedIn that I will direct to David. And it is from Rahim, and he asks, how many different strategic investments, how many different collaborations, joint ventures should a startup pursue? And so you mentioned several in your own journey with LightPoint Medical, and I'll ask Biren and Adam to weigh in on that as well. But I think the question is first directed at you, David.
I would hesitate to give a specific number, but as we all know, focus is king within a startup. I'm reminded of the piece of advice that strategy is what you don't do. And it can be very easy to chase a lot of partnering opportunities and strategic engagements for the headline and the visibility without fully thinking through what are the resource requirements and strategic implications. So I think it should be driven really by a very specific business need or a strategic need, rather than collecting alliances for the purposes of the headline. The one potential exception to that is that if that's a core part of your business model. So if you're doing B2B sales to medical device companies, then those might take the form of multiple partnerships. So that's perhaps an exception to that principle. But I would really have it be driven by the driving needs of the company, the need for focus as opposed to collecting shiny objects.
Thanks for that. And with that, and Biren, if you'd like to weigh in, absolutely go for it. I see both of you came off mute.
I'll just go first. I love the example there, David. It's the phrase "you've got more pilots going on than United" is not a compliment, right? It's focus is really important. One thing I'll go just to maybe a little bit more specifically is be really thoughtful about when you go exclusive with a partner. That's a really important decision to make. Yes, it beds you much more closely with one. It also just writes off the others, right? And certainly I've been personally in the example where that churns you off as a strategic onto a company and potentially closes a door on relationships that you may be able to pursue. But focus is definitely king. Too much focus may be a bit of a downside as well. So really thoughtful decision around exclusivity.
Yeah, I'll add, I agree. You got to be very selective about your partnerships. There's a lot of examples in medtech companies where companies took on way too many, and they were not meaningful enough. And it just diluted their efforts. Things got dragged on. They burned through a lot of capital, and you don't want that to happen. So I think Adam used the word, every partnership should be highly purposeful. You should know what is it you're trying to get out of the partnership. So in some cases, you might want to partner with the number one company in the space. And that's great because they're number one. And that says a lot about you if you get their partnership. On the other hand, the number one may not want to partner with you, or the number two or the number three. And you're like, well, what's my strategy now? Maybe you have to go to the number 5 player because you need to have a proof of concept of some partnership that will then be very attractive to the number 1 and number 2. But that's okay as long as it's purposeful. Going to number 5 because they knocked on your door and they said they'd be interested is not a good enough reason. So just as long as there's a clear strategy about why you're doing these partnerships, there is a ton of overhead that goes in any partnership on both sides, the strategic side and the startup side. So I would not take those lightly, and I think seems to be a common message across everyone, is be very, very selective with your partnerships. I would add just one more comment. From an investment standpoint, having investment from multiple strategics is probably in the interest of a startup. So if you can get two strategics to invest in your company, two or more, but let's say two, and even if both of them have a board seat, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That actually is quite a strong message to the market that and potentially is going to lead to a very nice bidding process when you want to exit. So I wouldn't say that it's bad to have multiple strategics invested, because managing an investment from a strategic versus a financial investor, there's not a big difference in terms of your overhead. It's really what we just talked about here is co-development and distribution partnerships that have a ton of overheads. So select them very carefully.
With that, we are on top of the hour. I want to thank our panelists and bid our online audience goodbye. But before I do that, excuse me, I always want to ask if there are folks who are following us on YouTube or LinkedIn Live who would like to connect with you. What's the best way to reach you? Is LinkedIn a good way? Is email a good way? How should people contact either you personally or your companies?
I can go first real quick and just say JJDC has a website with our contact information. So that with an email, that's probably the best way to reach out. LinkedIn is fine as well. I'm not as good at checking it as I should be, but emails are in front of us all day long.
Yep, Bob is fine. LinkedIn, email, smoke signals.
Fantastic. With that, we will bid our online audience goodbye. Cohort, please stay on the Zoom. We'll get to your direct questions